Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is David Godwin and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. And from our Southern Fire Exchange team, I'm joined today by Marinelle Armstrong with Tall Timbers Research Station. We're excited about our webinar today and we're glad you are here. Today we have a presentation by Mr. Andy Rappe from the Nature Conservancy in Florida, and he'll be talking about his lessons as a land manager balancing prescribed fire while also supporting opportunities for field researchers and experiential fire training. So without any more fuss, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Andy Rappe is the Preserve Management Director for the Nature Conservancy's Florida chapter. And in this role, he oversees the stewardship and development of the Nature Conservancy's network of preserves as part of its Center for Conservation Initiatives. Previously, he served as the Assistant Director of the University of Florida's Ordway-Swisher Biological Station, where he oversaw land management and station operations. Andy has an MS in ecological restoration and is pursuing a doctorate in education. He has over 18 years working in wildland fire, and he's passionate about training and education. So welcome, Andy. Glad to have you here. Excited to see your presentation. Thanks everybody who's joining us online. And just one moment as we trade out slides.
Thank you, David. And thanks, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. So my name is Andy Rappe, and I'm looking forward to talking with you today about prescribed burning for research and training objectives. And you'll see this says it's a field station case study. So what is a field station? Well, it's a outdoor living laboratory. And in this case, the case study is at the Ordway-Swisher Biological Station. So Ordway is a field station run through the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, IFAS, as a research, teaching, and extension mission. So it's a giant outdoor living laboratory. It's studying everything you can think of, really, from slime molds to plume moths to deer population studies to climate change to fire ecology, all sorts of things. Any given time, it has an average of about 60 active research projects going on at the site. So a little bit of my background, as David kindly teed me up, I've been working in fire for about 18 years. 8 of that was on traveling prescribed fire crews, mainly in the southeastern United States. And then about 10 years of that was working at the field station. And it looks like my slides are auto flipping. Hopefully that stops. So working at the field station for about 10 years, and then I have accepted a new role with the Nature Conservancy for just the last few weeks. And in this role, as David mentioned, I'm the Director of Preserve Management. So I'm coming to you today kind of wearing 2 hats. So it's an important distinction for the purposes of this case study. I'm talking about my role as the Assistant Director with the University of Florida at the Ordway-Swisher Biological Station and burning and working for them. And then I'm also wearing this current hat for contacting me and things like that with the Nature Conservancy. So when I use the royal we and when I talk about burning, I'm talking about working at Ordway and not at the Nature Conservancy. So that's an important distinction. So get the fine print out of the way there. So you can see this nice visualization. So this is the station. You can see it's in this pop out. It's in north central Florida. So we're located about 18 miles east of the University of Florida's main campus in Gainesville. You can also see it as this cool mosaic of different habitat types throughout the station. See if I can go back here. Sorry about the slideshow. I can turn this off. So it's this cool mosaic of habitat types throughout the station. It's got a mix of large wetlands from several 100-acre lakes to small ephemeral ponds, wet prairies, swamp systems. And then you can see this kind of beige color. This is the sandhill longleaf wiregrass ecosystem. And the whole station is about 9,600 acres. We've got about 3,600 acres of this sand hill. It's a pyrogenic ecosystem. Textbook will tell you it needs fire about every 2 to 4 years. So just to make the math easy, it needs fire about every 3 years, 3,600 acres of it. We need to burn about 1,200 acres a year just to kind of keep up with what we need to do to burn and be good stewards of the land. So why does that matter? If you picture a stool, you have a research, teaching, and extension mission as the three legs of that stool. And conservation and land management is kind of the seat that holds that whole thing together. And if you take that part out, the whole thing just kind of falls apart. So we're conducting high quality land and fire management to have something to research and to provide those teaching and extension opportunities. So it's an integral part of management at the station. However, research and teaching and extension are all baked into that mission. So when I'm talking about the sandhill ecosystem, just to give you some idea of what that looks like, you can see these two slides. This is fuel model 2, and it has this classic open and park-like look to it. You can see there's not much of a mid-story in the bottom slide, and it's got this really beautiful fluffy inflorescences on the wiregrass. You can tell it's got a growing season burn, and it's all flushed out and beautiful. You can also see the aerial from the top picture there. It burns pretty clean. There's not a lot of residual fuel on the ground. It's light, flashy fuels, not a lot of mop up. You can also see some infrastructure there where we've protected some research instrumentation. So we'll talk more about that. But I want to show you this so you have an idea of what this looks like. And then also, when I talk about training, this is what I'm primarily burning in. It's the sandhill ecosystem. So I think the broad strategies I talk about that are important with training are widely applicable, but some of the tactics one-to-one might not be as applicable in the sites you're working in as a land manager, as the sites you're burning in. But I wanted to kind of show this because each site's different, right? You have light, flashy fuels, that's kind of a watch out, but you can also see across this really easily, and you can see how the fire is behaving really easily and use that as a cool teaching tool for ignitions and things like that. So each site's a little different, but this is our sandhill. I like to tell people it's if you picture a tall grass prairie or an African savanna that happens to have pine trees on it, in this case, longleaf pine that are literally adding fuel to the fire, that's kind of how this system works. So it's very resilient, and I just love it. I think it's really neat. So to talk a little bit about fire management and the fire management program on the station, for the last 23 years, we've been burning with the Prescribed Fire Training Center, or PFTC. I've been burning with PFTC out there for about 10 years. If you're not familiar with the Prescribed Fire Training Center, this is an organization that provides training opportunities typically to mid-career wildland fire professionals, usually wildfire suppression folks from the Western United States that are working on these high-level position task books, such as burn boss, firing boss, things like that. We have seen that change over the years. Been getting folks from different agencies and different representations coming through. But it's primarily historically been Western fire suppression folks that are working on these prescribed fire qualifications. And that's what we've been working with for training. These folks will come and stay at the station for 3 or 4 days at a time. And we'll get as much burning as we can within that chunk of time. And I'll talk about a little bit how we kind of squeeze all the training we can get out of that opportunity. In the last 5 years, this is almost fresh, bear with me, but in 2016 to 2021, the station had 124 burns, 85% of which had cooperators on them. So the takeaway here is we could very rarely burn in-house and get what we needed to get burnt. We needed help from cooperators, and that often looked like anyone from a student to an intern to an interagency person helping us, all the way up to these mid-career federal professional folks. But I highlight it to illustrate that this helped us get the burning done. It supported our research and teaching mission, but it also facilitated us getting fire actively on the ground, and we couldn't have done it without it. Also, if you picture a sort of Venn diagram overlap, we often had teaching and research going on at the same time. These researchers tend to cluster equipment up on the ground. You can have 2 or 3 research projects in a single burn unit, and that overlaps with teaching and training going on as well. So the majority of the units we would burn had multiple research projects in them. We're still able to get the work done. So I think that's why Ordway is a good case study to talk about these things, because we're able to, in my opinion, have a robust fire management program while getting this teaching and research mission met as well. So I enjoy a table of contents. So we're almost done with the introduction. And then the talk will be broken out into sort of 2 chunks. We'll have a research piece where we have an initial conversation with the researchers. Then we'll talk about things to do pre-burn, things to do operationally while the burn is actually going on, and then some things we would do post-burn. Then we'll roll into the training piece, talk about things we do pre-burn, operations during the actual burn, and some things I like to add on to the after action review, or AAR, which you should be doing. And then at conclusion, we'll wrap it up with what's in it for you. Remind you, I talked about research on the front end, and then this will hopefully flow into a rich question and answer session. So I like to use humor as a teaching tool. And I mentioned that I had worked for about 8 years on fire crews before working at the station and conducting burns out there. So as a fire crew member, this is admittedly a little bit cynical way I thought a research burn or having ologists on the burn might have gone. Perhaps my supervisor is approached by a researcher that generates a lot of emails. Those emails lead to me doing a lot of prep work, raking around trees, making sure wires don't burn, things like that. This results in burning a small scale 1/4 acre at the opportunity cost of not burning a bigger unit. That results in some publication that might take a year to come out, and then the cycle continues. So again, admittedly a little bit cynical and hopefully a little bit funny, but I think it's important to acknowledge this, that research can be seen as a hindrance to burning, and burning is challenging anyway. So why would you want to add this other layer to it? But when I started Blossom Burns at the field station, I found this isn't really true. I found that burning made our program more rich. I think it can increase your deliverables if you're an administrator and you're tallying up what you've achieved for the year and burn by burn, kind of justifying your fire program and talking through it. This is a good way to do that. I think it also enriches your fire program. I think often as land managers and fire managers, we might tend to think about the conversation with the public and with other stakeholders, especially non-fire people. We focus on hazard fuel reduction, and that's certainly a really important piece. But there are all these other aspects to burning that can be increased with research. You can think through social science questions. You can think through firefighter health and safety questions. You can think about all these ecological questions in addition to that. And these, it's funny, but as you get more research going on out there, the research generates its own press and its own prestige, and takes your fire management program and your site along with it. So it can be an interesting vehicle to generate good press and notoriety and highlight the important work that we're all doing. And I also really believe that it steers scientists to meaningful land and fire management questions. So this is an opportunity as land managers to interact with scientists on the ground and kind of tell them questions that you think are really compelling, tell them what keeps you up at night. And conversely, it's an opportunity for scientists to interact with land managers and kind of think through and understand where they're coming from, what's a practical application if they're looking for good applied science, and to think about kind of what the questions are that might not be, the current academic flavor or the most fundable question, but are nonetheless really important that people want to know. So I think that's a huge plus in the research column. So I'd like to talk about kind of some nuts and bolts strategies and tactics that I've found to be useful. The most important question to get started is, what are your agency's requirements for having researchers on a burn? If you're a private landowner, it might not be very much. Could be a waiver. It could be a hard no. These are things that are important to think about on the front end and be proactive with while you have a lot of time. Is it a simple volunteer form? Is it formally establishing a fire crew member that has, federal burn qualifications through the National Wildland Coordinating Group? Is it coming up with a fire observer role where this person can be on the fire provided they're in PPE and you've got somebody has eyes on them and they're kind of shadowed by a trained firefighter all day? What does this look like? So these are some important things to think through. Something that's a little more subtle that I'd like to highlight is to consider listing research and training objectives in your prescription. My opinion, they're legitimate burn objectives. Remember that Venn diagram where I'm used to doing multiple things on a burn. So if you're doing a training burn anyway, I'm handing the prescription to the trainee burn boss and they're looking through it and they're reading this out in a briefing. And this kind of legitimizes it that one of their goals for the day is to provide a training opportunity. And it also highlights that we're burning experimental burn plots, and you can quantify that. 90% of the plot will get burned for Dr. X, things like that. And that's talked through in the briefing. I'll also have the researchers at the briefing, and we'll talk about what that looks like as well. So for that initial conversation, once I have a researcher, this is that Venn diagram, or I'm sorry, my cynical flow chart where you're at that lots of emails phase. I think it's important to designate one high level point of contact between the researchers and the land manager. And this is I'll call it a cultural thing. You're trying to bridge that gap between the fire management culture, which is often really militaristic and has this chain of command, which is really important in emergencies, don't get me wrong. But you have this academic culture that maybe not as much with the chain of command. So you're establishing that that's a thing right off the bat. I would do it with the point of contact would be, if you're charging for it, which we did at the station, that point of contact is the person that's getting the bill, and you can put it to them that way. You can also say that the point of contact is the one that's taking responsibility for everyone else that's being on site. And then you also talk to other people that are working for them. So if it's the principal investigator on the research project, everyone in their lab, their technicians or grad students, they understand that they're to go through that primary investigator or PI, and that person is talking to your land manager, your burn boss, or whomever, and that establishes that tone right away. And that makes your life a lot easier on burn days. It also cuts down on all those emails from that flow chart I had. Next thing I like to do is have the entire lab, everyone associated with the project from the academic side, go out into the field if at all possible. Meet with your land management folks, meet with the people that are going to be on the fire. And you can do this and talk through some things. If they want to be in the sandhill in this pyrogenic ecosystem, ask them, will your project be affected by fire? If they don't want it burned, you could get them in an area that was just burned and be honest with them and say, hey, this was just burned. It's going to get burned again in 2 years. This is the biggest window of time you're likely to have to not get your stuff burned, barring a wildfire. They want their things burned, tell them, be honest, fire is stochastic. There are variables with weather, there are variables with burn bans, equipment, personnel. I can't guarantee we'll get this. If we can't get this, is your student not going to graduate? Are you not going to meet these client deliverables? What does this look like? Can you replicate it at multiple sites on the station to increase those odds of success? And can you stick them somewhere that's either easier to burn or is a high priority to burn, and still get those objectives met for both parties? And we'll talk about some tactics to really increase those odds as much as possible. But you want to have that conversation. Will this be successful if we don't burn? Have the entire lab come out to the field, as I said, show them where they're going to meet if they need to be out there day of for a briefing, time getting out there. Think through all these things is kind of one of those go slow to go fast later type things. And you want to go fast later that day of the burn. I also want to be clear about the amount of notice prior to burning. This is one of those cultural things. They may not be used to how fire works and that you're getting notified the day of after that afternoon weather comes out, or you're getting notified of a cancellation the morning of. And that chain of command is the PI getting notified of the cancellation, and do they know to pass that down the chain so you don't have people showing up when they're not supposed to, or you don't have people, worst case scenario, out in the burn unit collecting data and not knowing that it's going to get burned that day. So you want to be really mindful of those watch out situations. And then lastly, you want to describe just what a day of burning looks like. Don't make assumptions. Assume they know, like, there aren't designated breaks. There may not be a designated lunch. Don't get separated from your food. Things like that. And have them really understand, kind of paint that picture of what that operational period is going to look like. And I'll talk a little bit more about how I try to have them out there the entire burn, if at all possible, and why that's important. So pre-burn, this sounds kind of silly, but once you've gone through these conversations, really ask them, hey, do you have to be there? Can you replace them with a pin flag? Can you use that as a backup plan? If they don't have to be there, but they kind of want to, can you still have as much flexibility as possible and have a pin flag or have that equipment out in the field? If it's a really simple thing, can you do that for them? Your burn crew doesn't need to be collecting data, but is it flipping a switch? Is it taking a picture so it's time stamped and they know what time fire hit their infrastructure and burned through it if they want it to burn? A couple of simple things like that. But it certainly gives you a lot more flexibility if they don't have to be there, especially if you have multiple projects going on at the same site. One thing that helps this is to give them specific, easily recognizable flagging. So I mentioned at Ordway, we had 60 plus active research projects. We would try our best if they needed flagging on the ground to have them have their own recognizable color pattern, whatever it was, so that we could tell whose it was. That might be a little bit overkill for some organizations. If that's the case, can you have just a separate color of flagging that you give researchers the day of? For example, our teaching flagging on the station was white and red checkered. And then we used orange flagging for hazard, spot fires, hazard trees. It was some flavor of orange. So you can tell that from a truck moving by. Is that flagging for the spot fire that somebody called in over the radio, or is that flagging for, a game camera that some researcher set out last year? You can tell that really easily. So that's a simple thing that I found to be pretty important and is an easy lesson learned. Left to their own devices, people I've found will, use what they have. You don't want to waste the stuff you have on hand, or they'll use the stuff at the hardware store up the road, which is orange, which is why we use that color. Another thing, the intent here is to have the researchers working to facilitate what you're doing as a land manager and to keep that operational tempo up. So can they provide spatial data for your maps? Can you get them out there with you day of when you're doing that site visit ahead of time? Can they take GPS data then? If it's a multi-year study, can you incorporate that into your burn maps? If it's not, can you hand them that orange and, not orange, sorry, the white and red flagging and have them mark it on the ground and take a quick data point? You'll have them in your briefing. Can you have them map where it's at? Have them do that for you and make sure they do it. Another trick I found to be really useful is to place the plot at test fire. You can see this person in the picture as this cool smoke apparatus, and you can also see kind of a blurry Type 6 engine in the background and two roads if you really look. So they're actually at test fire. They wanted to get smoke. That's what this gizmo is measuring, particulate matter in smoke. So I put them downwind at the test fire, and everybody wins in this scenario, in my opinion. The researcher is going to get their smoke. Even if the burn gets shut down in test fire, you've still met that objective. You've met that research objective. They got their smoke. If we needed to defend infrastructure with water, we have the truck right there. And then you also don't have the researcher out in the burn unit. They're right on the edge of the road in full PPE. You see where they are at. Everything goes well. Also, sometimes they need stuff to burn all day. They need it to smolder. If you do it at test fire, it can burn all day. Make sure it's communicated in the briefing not to put it out unless it's a holding concern. But you've got good odds that that whole burn period, their stuff's going to smolder. So a lot of great reasons to do it at test fire if you can. Another thing I found to be really important, to have the researcher do several dry runs to get you a good time of how long it's going to take to set it up. This thing just goes on a tripod and went up pretty quick, maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes they have to put in all these wires and sensors and things that might take longer. And this is that day of kind of understanding so that the researchers understand, hey, if we're doing test fire at 10, briefing at 8:30, I need you to be in the briefing at 8:30. they've timed it out and they know it takes an hour to set their stuff up. They've done dry runs. Talk them into doing 90% of it the day before. You're trying to backwards engineer so you don't end up in a situation where you're waiting on the researchers to get done before you can do that test fire, and it's pushing you later into the day. So that's the intent behind it. So really having them do a couple of dry runs and understanding that timing is a really good thing to do, in my opinion. During the briefing, I mentioned I have researchers stay there all day. I have them sit through the whole briefing if at all possible. You're getting their emergency contact information just like everyone else. You're treating them just like a fire crew member. I make them part of my org chart. For that burn, I will designate a chief of party for them, give that person a radio, teach them how to use it. We call them science on the radio. And then you've got a good way to roll them into your burn operations. I'll also, during the briefing, have that chief of party give a 2-minute summary. And I'm not looking necessarily for an abstract of this is what my research is doing, but I'm looking for what do they have on the ground and what do they need from us. For instance, this picture, you see this Pelican case with wires hanging out. Those wires wrapped in foil, they wanted to burn. The ones wrapped not in foil, they really did not want to burn. That's important to know. Also, can you squirt water on this thing? What's in there? What's going on with it? Can it get hot? Can it not? So things like that are really good to know. So those are the kind of details you're trying to tease out in that 2-minute summary. Also, I think it's important to have them define their metrics. By metrics, I just mean types of measurement. So fire people and foresters are used to thinking in chains. A chain is 66 feet. The researchers might not know what a chain is. They may not be working in feet. They might be working in meters. They might not be working in acres. They might be working in hectares. So I'm a firm believer in that clear communication. It doesn't really matter what it is, but that information has to get across. So I'll tell people if they're new to fire, they're on the burn, look, a chain is 66 feet. When was the last time you went bowling? Bowling alley lane is 60 feet. If you hear somebody on the radio saying they're pulling fire, they're a chain away from your research, picture a bowling lane, close enough. So whatever you have to do to get that point across. But briefings are a good time to make that determination and make sure everyone's on the same page. Then I think it's a good idea to determine any, I call them non-fire bonus qualifications. So ask in briefing, are they flying a UAV? Do they have a drone? These researchers, if you got a test fire and they're done early in the day, that's useful. Maybe they have a drone that you can use for something. Are they taking weather data? If that's not needed for your burn, for your FEMO, your fire effects monitor, can they provide that afterwards? That might be good supplemental stuff for you to go through. Do they have equipment with them that might be useful to you? Do they have a truck that they're getting out to the burn? And they probably do. How many seats open does it have? If you're doing summer burning and you need an AC truck down here in Florida, might be good to know where that is and how many seats are available on the burn. If you're doing summer burning down here in Florida and you have our pop-up summer thunderstorms, might be good to have that as a contingency plan to be able to have those extra couple seats to move people into the burn. So again, the intent is to think about kind of what they can do for you on the fire. During operations, as I mentioned, I treat them like a squad to maintain that span of control. And you're kind of reinforcing this with that chain of command conversation you've been having since you first met with these folks. So they kind of see that coming and they understand what's going on. We talked about if they're taking weather anyway, is that a useful thing for you? Researchers are professional observers, right? So they have a radio, you can get with them, ask them their flame lengths. You'll have agreed on the metric. So when they tell you it's 2 meters, you will have talked about that and understand what that means. Those are important things to think about, especially if you've had they got their science done at test fire and you have the rest of the day to work with them. Can you roll them into useful operations? Some things that we've done on the station are to have them take pictures. I believe, never underestimate the power of documenting things. And who knows, you might need them like years later for a presentation. You never know when they're going to come in handy. But they can take pictures for you. Some things we've thought about, can they be a smoke spotter for you? Sometimes they're taking column observations as part of their research. Can the fire effects monitor utilize them for things like that? If they have that truck and it happens to be parked at an intersection or a neighbor's house or anything like that, can you get with them to put the hazards on? Can you do useful things? So how can they benefit you into the burn operations? Post-burn, you'll got their emergency contact information and things like that in the briefing on the front end, but make sure you get their personal contact information on the back end. This is something I like to add on to get those pictures, to talk to them about publications. Remember that flow chart a year later, maybe it comes out. So you want to have a point of contact to get a hold of that. And then also, these folks may not be used to checking fire equipment out of a cache. Remember, you issued them PPE. Can you track them down if they accidentally walk away with that hard hat, things like that. Goes the other way too, unless you want a collection of, stickered up, crusty Nalgene bottles, do you have a way to reach them to get those back as well? So that's a good thing to get. As for publications, that's good. We also, remember, they're there the whole time. They're in the debriefing and the after action review. We often focus on safety and communication, ignition techniques, first order fire effects, things like that. But it's also important to think about the experimental design and ask the researchers how it went for them and have them participate in the debriefing as well. You can see this person's lighting near this beautiful lake, and you can see in the mid-ground there's a metal and concrete structure. That's a groundwater monitoring well. Pretty robust, pretty fire resistant. You can't quite see, it's cropped out of the frame. There's a PVC version that was a predecessor to this that has quite the lean to it from getting melted every other year, a little bit in burns. So talking through things like that, did this work well for you? What can we improve? Was the placement of the plot easy to defend? Is it worth the trade-off with the scientists getting it away from the edge of the road for the operational difficulty of having to go interior to defend it or not? It's kind of thinking about and talking about those things, what you might change. So I'd like to shift gears to training a little bit. And remember, I like to use a little bit of humor as a teaching tool. So in the past, when I was on fire crews, I might have thought that a training burn would look something like this. You have all of these people with the white boxes are the overhead. They're the leadership on the burns. And then you have two people at the bottom in red doing the actual work. One FFT2, firefighter type 2 lighting, one engine operator doing the holding, and everyone else is kind of telling them what to do. I didn't find that to be the case. That's kind of a worst case example scenario, but it is important to acknowledge that you can have a lot of folks on the fire line kind of telling you what to do. So I'd like to point out some ways to mitigate that a little bit and to think through what we've done with training. So it's important. I think we can all realize it's important to conduct wildland fire trainings to provide experiential learning opportunities to develop our future fire leaders, right? That's how you learn often, is by doing these things. So it is important, but some maybe less readily apparent reasons why we might do this. I believe it benefits your staff as a fire manager. I think we become better students of fire by being teachers of fire. We learn more and understand more by telling people how we're going to do it. Down here in the sandhills, we're burning this habitat every other year. So it resists the urge of complacency by staff to say, oh, we'll just do it like we did last time. That worked pretty well. Well, did it? Is lack of failure really a success? Should we maybe talk through how we did it? Is the weather different? Is the fuel loading different? Was that firing pattern really great? Can we improve it? So to talk through it and think through it fights complacency. It also keeps your folks refreshed on the incident command system, ICS. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when before you get a large wildfire if you have a big natural area. So understanding how to talk to cooperators and how to have everything fit in, how to clone up radios, how to talk to radios, how these generic position descriptions work is really important to keep your folks sharp on that. It also builds interagency relationships. Speaking for myself, I would hardly have ever burned with our federal partners without the Prescribed Fire Training Center. So that was an important way to work with other folks from across the country and across the world. It also allowed me to kind of cherry pick the best aspects of some of these different agencies and things and incorporate that into our fire program. And conversely, it takes a little bit thicker skin, but you receive that feedback on your program of things that maybe you can polish up and improve a little bit more, or questions about why you're doing things. So you get that feedback as well. And then just as a practical thing, we work with PFTC a lot in January and February and burn during the dormant season. We'd also burn with them in the spring and through June. But in those first couple of months, it would help you fill black for bigger burns. So for example, last year in 2022, we were able to burn 3 sides of about a 400-acre chunk of sandhill, get that done earlier in the year with these training burns, and that allowed you to come back in the growing season with a little bit tighter windows and burn those out, maybe with fewer staff or maybe under different conditions because you had good black all the way around it. So that's something to consider as well. So this is just some paperwork for our federal friends. You'll see this is a modified 214 form, but I will photocopy this front and back, make a couple copies out of the prescription, and I'll carry this with me on the burn for the burn boss, and the trainee burn boss has a copy as well. What I'd like to highlight is we use this burn manager position. This is not an NWCG formal position. This comes from the Florida Forest Service. They have a certified prescribed burn manager program. So this allows us to cut down on that org chart a little bit. The burn manager is the local burn boss that's actually pulling the burn permit for the day. Then you have the burn boss, that's the trainee on the burn. And this is a pretty important position. If someone's on the radio calling for the burn boss, there's probably a reason for that. So we've run into instances either using a repeater or having a bad radio, something like that, where you couldn't tell if somebody was asking for the burn boss or the burn boss trainee. So if you have that burn manager role, that's just easier, clear on the radio for people to hear. And I'll talk about how we utilize this position a little bit more. That's worked pretty well for us. Something else we do, if you're like me and you have a hard time remembering last names for these major roles, burn manager, burn boss, division leaders, things like that, we'll say the position title on the radio instead of the person's last name. So the burn manager calling the burn boss on the radio instead of, Andy Rappe calling, Jane Doe on the radio. It's a little trickier to remember that if you're in the middle of the burn sometimes. So that's one way we cut down on that org chart. During operations for the briefing, I'll do a couple of things. I'll provide what I call an overhead pre-briefing. So this is those major leadership positions that folks are in trainee roles for. So the local burn manager, the burn boss trainee, the firing boss trainee, a handful of people will go into a separate area and they will hash out the firing plan, go through the prescription, things like that, to get ready for the bigger briefing. And this cuts down and is more efficient. So you don't have this monster, couple-hour briefing to get you ready for your burn for the day. So while this overhead briefing is going on, all the other fire personnel, including the locals, will go and do a tour of the local equipment, figure out all the quirks and things like that, clone up radios, start getting the map on the whiteboard, things like that. And that saves time. Something else I've found, other than selecting the right weather for the day for your prescribed burn, selecting the org chart and really doing that efficiently and thinking who's in what's role is kind of your second biggest decision point that'll save you a whole lot of time or not and result in high quality burn or maybe a little bit less high quality. So one way to really think through that, have a lot of control over that and still have a good teaching opportunity is to have this smaller group where you're going through it with leadership and to ensure that you seed locals into equipment and into groups of people. And this also cuts down on those trainee and handler roles. So instead of having an engine boss trainee and an engine boss, you could have a local person with that engine boss trainee on a piece of equipment. And it might be someone that's got a lot of experience with the truck and things like that and is able to face-to-face get with this person, but you don't have somebody on the radio talking to the engine boss and the engine boss trainee. Also, if you've got 3 or 4 lighters, interior of the unit, lighting strip head fires, having a local that's interacting with them can kind of help them read the fuels and talk through it and alleviate some of those extra needs. And it's a good common sense way to set you up for success. And you can't do that without local expertise. So you need that kind of separate breakout group. And then something else that's kind of philosophical is to ask questions for the good of the group. And it's kind of just a teaching mentality and encourage your folks to do that, even if you know the answers. I mentioned I'll have the burn manager as a floater on the ground during the burn. So you can see me kind of in the blue hard hat in the middle, nervously going between this piece of infrastructure and the lighters. So I'll get a face-to-face with the burn boss and the firing boss and walk around the unit if I can, if it's a good size to do that. It cuts down on radio traffic and it cuts down on the need for multiple roles. Again, kind of a philosophical teaching tool. I make sure to explicitly state my intent or my desired end state, or conversely, my desired end state is not to see, melted guy wires on the power lines, whatever it is. So you can paint that picture, because these are higher level folks. You just kind of have to point them in the right direction, but explicitly do that. I'll also set trigger points. If at 1400 we've burnt to here, we'll reassess if we're going to keep going or not. If we see a spot at test fire, I don't know, we'll reassess what we're going to do. I'll explicitly state that and make that known to folks. So that's another good teaching tool. Debrief. I mentioned if we're burning with PFTC, we'll burn for multiple days in a row. So I give the burn boss, the trainee burn boss on the fire, I'll have them check the burn the night of and make sure it's within mop-up parameters of that prescription and everything's looking good. And then I'll have them let me know the next morning, is it looking good? Is it within the parameters of those prescriptions? And it has to be before we'll do another burn. And that gives them ownership and makes it as realistic as possible. And it also allows you to kind of squeeze all of the good teaching you can out of that experience for the people that you're providing that opportunity to. If you finish early on your burn, you still have daylight, we'll drive around the unit for the next day and get that field time. Another thing you can do is, especially if you're doing task book work and signing things off for people that you're training, it's a good idea to ask around and ask them what their qualifications are. Do they have, I don't know, any high level saw quals? Do they have any high level weather quals? Something that might be useful to your local folks to incentivize them and get them excited about teaching and kind of keep them into it as well, because it is a little bit more work to do these training burns, but that's the other side of it. It exposes yourself and your folks to these high level people too. What can you learn from them? So to wrap it up, with training, you get more help burning. When we do the basic 130, 190 class, I'm passing out business cards at the end. These people have fire training, so that can broaden your volunteer pool. I really, truly believe it helps you build a better fire program through teaching. Research, remember, you can tell a better story and get press. You can increase your deliverables, and I really believe it's important to, which is why I'm excited to talk as part of the Southern Fire Exchange webinar series, to steer scientists to answer land and fire management questions and to give land managers a voice to talk to scientists and interact with them. I think bridging that gap is really meaningful and important. So with that, we can roll into the Q&A, and here's my email address if you have any questions. Thank you.
All right, Andy, thank you so much for your presentation. That if you joined us while Andy was speaking, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange program with the University of Florida. And we just had a presentation with Andy Rappe, who is now with the Nature Conservancy in Florida, but previously was with the University of Florida and the assistant director at the Ordway Swisher Biological Station. Awesome presentation, Andy. Thank you so much. I feel like you just gave us like a huge dump of so many different lessons learned over the years of working both with, I can't even imagine how many different PFTC crews have come through as all in addition to working with researchers and scientists folks and graduate students and undergraduates all coming out to Ordway. So with that, Marinelle's put in the chat, if you have questions that you would like us to get through, please take those questions and put them in the Q&A tool in Zoom. We have enabled a feature so that if you see questions from other attendees and you would like us to get to those questions, you can give them a thumbs up, and that'll help us to prioritize the questions that come in so we can get to the ones that are of most interest to folks on the line. Andy, I don't know if you can see the chat. We had a question already from an attendee. If you could put your email address there in the chat so that folks could reach out. I saw we had another question came in earlier from Ramon asking if you'd be willing to share a copy of that burn plan document that you showed a couple of screenshots from.
Yeah, I put my email in the chat. So if you will take the time to email me, we can discuss that. I'd be happy to.
All right, here's I see a question that came in from Jay, and Jay is asking if you have any thoughts. You mentioned publications, and asking if the researchers would share their publications with you as a station manager, as a land manager. Jay is asking what kind of publications or outcomes from research would tend to be most valuable to you as a manager?
The short answer is they're all valuable. You never know when they're going to be handy. I found it the most fulfilling to me personally as a land manager when one of these publications led to a line of research, and you would see how what they discovered in one thing, they used that data and that built up and led to other things, and you keep working and build this relationship with a researcher over time and can kind of see science work because it can be slow. So it's cool to see it work over these iterations and see the process play out and make these feedback loops to where science is informing what you're doing and vice versa. I think that's really neat.
Are you interested in like peer review publications or fact sheets or synthesis papers or uh, shorter documents that came out, presentations? What kind of things would you be interested in the researchers, going back and sharing with you?
Yeah, so the big one was getting, refereed journal articles and having those tracked as far as our documentation goes. But I think any kind of presentations they could give at a symposium of what they had done out at the station can be real valuable. And that's where that taking pictures comes in. That's really handy for that kind of stuff. We didn't tend to get maybe quite as many white papers, and I'm not sure if that was just harder to track or how that was going, but it tended to be a mix of journal articles primarily, and then presentations. I would say the second.
Great. Let's see, any other questions that have come in here? Here's one from Paul. Paul says, do you train researchers to do pre-burn prep on their own equipment or sites that need to be protected from fire? That could be some interesting conversations to have.
That is an interesting conversation. So it depends. So I'll give you an example where we do. So that big tower that I was standing in front of in that picture, that's the National Ecological Observatory NEON. That's their Eddy, help me out, David, Eddy Carbon Flux Covariance Tower or something like that. It's a nice 50-cent word. It's a big old expensive tower that measures the forest breathing in real time. It's very neat. So for that tower is there for 20 years plus, so we've had 3, 4, 5 different times we've burned that. We've got to the point to where we're working with their staff who are actually fire trained and working with them to do the prep on that infrastructure with us ahead of time. So we're moving towards that. So it just depends on what's practical. It's certainly really important to ask if they're fire trained if they can do it, because some of this stuff, there's two sides to it. There's protecting their equipment and things like that. There's also protecting the resource. That wire graph that I was talking about in that bottom one of those first slides, where I'm like, oh, look at the fluffy inflorescences. It's beautiful. That stuff really doesn't like disturbance. And so you can get in there with a rake and, not intentionally, but rake around your research. And then you're just creating this bare spot that's there for a really long time. And it's Florida. So that bare spot provides ground for other invasive plants to move in and things like that. So it is important to talk to them and work with both the land managers and the researchers.
So I had a question for you. When you had trainees, when you had PFTC crews at Ordway, did you also have researchers on those burns at the same time?
Yeah, we often would, and that was a good learning experience because you're really talking through stuff, and that's why I several times referred to tempo, like you're trying to really keep that up because you're spinning all these plates at the same time. So yeah, we did. I think we had one where I had researchers on a burn, the media on a burn for Prescribed Fire Week, something like that, and PFTC. So you can get all these things going at once, and it can be a challenge, but you can get it done, and that's why I try to kind of highlight and think like a backpacker. How can this do like three things for me, and use that time efficiently, and get that researcher to help you, do whatever, take weather, or move people out there in their truck and do these different things to see how you can keep all those plates spinning.
I think that's pretty powerful. We hear in in my line of work with the fire science exchanges, we hear a lot of discussion about co-production of knowledge, right? And that's what you're talking about. You're talking about some kind of land manager or fire managers in our cases, and scientists and researchers working together through that process. But I like what you're talking about is like taking the whole thing to another level with more depth, because you're pulling in trainees. And so by pulling in trainees to that process, now you're educating like a whole nother generation in a way of people to be thinking about connecting researchers and scientists with land management while they're training. And this is it's pretty cool. Do Are you aware of other research stations or places where they're doing this kind of connectivity, this kind of interaction between research, science, training, and management all in one place?
I'm sure there are. I'm blanking on it right now. There are other places that certainly do fire training, and have a land management and research mission. So in Florida, Archbold Biological Station did a 130-190 fire training this year, and they certainly have a heavy research mission. Their field station as well, and they're doing all these things as well. So I think people are doing it. I think each field station's unique, and the flavors are a little different, but I think it's really cool, and it is all integrated. It took a little bit of doing for me to tease these apart out into categories, because they are so integrated, and that's why I settled on that stool metaphor. I was like, you kind of need them all, or it comes apart. So it's interesting to look at.
All right. Well, it looks like we're starting to get up towards the end of our time today. Thank you, everybody who provided questions and participated in the call. Andy, is there anything else that you would like to, share with our audience today?
Yeah, it's real quick. I'll put my Nature Conservancy hat back on again, and encourage folks to check out the Center for Conservation Initiatives. It's worth looking up. It's a really exciting center through the Nature Conservancy.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Andy. I have a note here, a little tidbit of wisdom I just gained from you today. I'll always remember you said, don't get separated from your food.
Absolutely.
Like, there's an answer right there. If you took anything from the webinar today, don't get separated from your food. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to follow up with Andy on this presentation, or any questions to talk about his current programs with the Nature Conservancy, or his previous experience working at Ordway, we have his email address here on the screen.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's good speaking with you all.
All right, thanks everybody, and we hope that this webinar will be useful in your fire management programs, and have a good afternoon.